Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, you can get it in your favorite podcast player, Pocket Casts, the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, all those different places. You can also visit geektherapyradio.com for more information. I just redesigned the page, so you should check it out. Okay, enough preamble. No 2 minutes of preamble here. We're getting right to the meat and potatoes. Apple Podcasts. So speaking of Apple, no more than maybe 10 minutes ago, WWDC 2020 just ended. And first comments on 2020 WWDC is that I'm so happy that it was pre-recorded. I know some people are wondering, is it going to be live? Is it going to be pre-recorded? It obviously looked like most of it, if not all of it, was pre-recorded. And I, for one, am thankful for that. I have no beef with that. There's no fake hand clapping. There's no fake applause, nothing like that. If they had done it live, I know a lot of people were worried. If they did it live, then they would have to add the fake applause and things like that. How is this all going to work? It was a super slick presentation, and I think a very smart move to do it pre-recorded. I was very happy to see that. No qualms for me about that. You got to figure they had all the time, not all the time in the world, but they had plenty of time to put this together, put this presentation together, and I think they did it flawlessly. Now, I should point out right off the bat here that I am not an Apple fanboy. The only Apple product I have right now is my iPad, which is at home. I've had iPhones over the years. I had the iPhone 4S. I think I had the iPhone 3G before that. Since then, I've been entirely Android as far as my phone is concerned. My PCs are all Intel-based, Microsoft Windows PCs. I don't have a Mac right now. But after this WWDC 2020, if I had a Mac on pre-order, I would wait. And that is kind of the first bit of advice from me. And I don't mean just to be an advice, because I can't give you consumer information or tell you what to do, obviously. But right now, I have always been on the fence about whether or not to get a Mac, because I've been waiting for this rumor that Apple was going to transition to in-house silicon, make their own system on chips, their own SoCs, their own bionic chips to put inside of different Mac devices, not just their iPhones and iPads, but actually into Macs and MacBooks and MacBook Pros and MacBook Airs and iMacs and whatever, what have you. I don't know about MacBook Pro. Maybe one day we'll see that. They didn't Did they specifically mention MacBook Pro? I'm not going to comment on that right now, but they have, in WWDC 2020, officially announced their transition away from Intel to their own in-house SoCs, which is huge. And while I was on the fence for myself buying a Mac, I am no longer on that fence. I'm going to still wait to see what the first offering of Macs containing the new Apple SoCs is. We can speculate to what that is. If you haven't already noticed, most of the buzz about today is going to be this transition from Intel to SoC. Almost nobody is going to be talking about the new feature improvements to iOS 14 and iPod OS and all of that. Yes, they're cool. We get widgets, and there's things that Android has been doing for years that it's good to see Apple finally integrating into their own ecosystem. But and again, it's all great. It's all very cool. The software developments are very cool. But most of what's going to be talked about today and for the next few weeks and few months and probably a few years is this transition away from Intel to Apple in-house silicon and the ramifications that has across the entire industry. So back to what Macs I'm looking for. We have seen that the MacBook, just the base level MacBook, not the MacBook Air, not the MacBook Pro, but the base level MacBook has disappeared in recent times from Apple's official offerings. Of course, you can still buy used MacBooks. I would be thrilled. And actually, I'd kind of expect it, and I would be surprised if they didn't offer one of the first Apple SoCs in a new MacBook. Not just the MacBook Pro, not just the MacBook Air, but bring back the MacBook, but have it powered entirely by Apple's new in-house system on chips. I would probably place an order for that one, given financial circumstances, of course, if I was able to do so. The first Mac I would buy in years, and I have had Macs in the past. I've had iMacs and different things, Mac Minis in the past. I just don't have one right now. So the first Mac that I would buy in years would be a MacBook with Apple's in-house silicon running the show behind the scenes. Now, one of the reasons why this is so huge, and they addressed one of my main concerns, and it wouldn't just be mine, it'd be across the industry. This would be a lot of us geeks' main concerns is, okay, we assume that this transition to Apple SoCs would include some sort of native application ecosystem to where there are native apps like iMessage and GarageBand is a better example. Final Cut, Logic Pro, all of that would be made native to run natively off of Apple's SoC. Well, what about third-party software? What about those of us who use Pro Tools and Adobe Premiere and other major third-party applications that are also developed for Mac? Well, Apple addressed this for running on Apple's SoC, on Bionic SoCs, with the Rosetta 2 programming emulation software, basically what it is. And they've done this before with the first Rosetta when they transitioned away from PowerPC to Intel. I think that was back in the mid 2000s, 2005-ish, when they went from PowerPC CPUs to Intel Core 2 CPUs, Core 2 Duos and Core 2 Quads and what have you. Around that time period, they used a program called Rosetta to, in the interim at least, emulate software from PowerPC over to Intel, and now they're doing the same thing with Rosetta 2 to emulate x86 software to run on their own Apple SoCs and Bionic SoCs. That is thrilling. So at least in the interim, you should, according to Apple, you be able to run all of your x86 programs through this emulator, the Rosetta 2 emulator, and other software and other technology to be able to run, yes, your Photoshop, to run your Pro Tools, to run whatever other development software you're using, any other third-party software on your Apple SoC until those third-party developers completely recompile their code to run natively on Apple's SoCs. So that means those of us who use Pro Tools and that third-party non-native software will still be able to run it at shipping time on the new Mac or on the new Apple SoC powered devices, which should be shipping by the end of the year, according to Apple. Now, what product is that going to be in? We don't know specifically yet. I would love to see it in a MacBook, like I mentioned, maybe a MacBook Air, maybe iMacs. Who knows what they're going to launch it in? But all of our software should run on those SoCs right out of the box using Rosetta 2 and other software. And I am just thrilled for that. But perhaps what I'm most excited for here, absolutely most excited for here, is Apple didn't just drop a pond into the computer industry. They didn't just drop a pedal into the pond to let the ripples reach the shore. They slammed a friggin' meteor into that pond with this transition to SoCs. This is going to, not to mention the huge ramifications this is going to have for Intel. Intel is having a hard time right now, to say the least, with AMD's rise in the past few years, and now other manufacturers, Dell and other manufacturers, going away from Intel to AMD chips, and now one of their biggest buyers, Apple, saying we're not going to use you guys anymore. That's going to be a huge blow to Intel. But dropping the meteor in the pond, what that means is Apple going to ARM-based processors, their own system on chips, means that the entire industry, it's not going to be too long before they file suit. And why that has me excited is that it means eventually all that software like Pro Tools that has been recompiled for Bionic processors, Apple's Bionic processors, means that those third-party developers might recompile the code maybe to run on other ARM-based processors like Qualcomm's, like your Samsung Galaxy Notes, your flagship phones. And that means theoretically, and this is hope, this is complete speculation. I am not saying that this is going to happen anytime soon in the near future, but we can speculate and be hopeful that this could mean a transition across the board away from x86, not completely away from x86, but to have conceivably, possibly in the future, running Pro Tools, running Adobe Premiere, running Adobe Photoshop officially, all of that, all those big software titles on our phones, not just iOS phones, but actual, on Samsung phones. And as long as they're recompiling the code to run on non-x86 architecture, that could mean that we'd see more fully featured applications. You won't even call them apps, you call them applications and software just on the devices in our pocket. Pair of Bluetooth connected to a TV, Bluetooth keyboard and a mouse possibly, connect this thing to a TV and basically have a fully featured PC that you can do real work on in your pocket. Let's talk about performance per watt and why that's exciting. So I'm reading this little blurb from Ars Technica here, and this paragraph at the very end of this story, and I'll link it in the podcast description below. And if I upload this to YouTube, yes, I'm recording video on this, I'll link the link below as well. It says in this blurb from Ars Technica, quote, Apple's chip division has reached the point where it should be able to reliably compete with Intel on performance. The 2020 iPad Pro with an Apple A12Z SoC turns in a comparable Geekbench score to a 2019 MacBook Pro with an Intel Core i9. So, an Apple SoC in a laptop with a higher thermal budget should do well. End quote. So what this means here is that, according to Apple, they've been able to, at least in Geekbench, at least in this one benchmark, they've been able to compete comparably to an Intel Core i9. Now, I don't have to remind most of you listening that when Apple first put a Core i9 into their MacBook Pro, it had issues and caused a big disturbance across the industry. It marked, actually, in the end, it turned out to be a good thing. It marked a turning point in Apple's, in the way Apple reacts to customer demand and customer recommendations. They redesigned the next, after the 2018 MacBook Pro, they redesigned the newest MacBook Pros to have a better thermal solution to allow the i9 to breathe better, cool better, and get more performance out of it. They gave us the escape key back on the touch bar, the stupid touch bar, which they should still get rid of entirely, but they have a physical escape key. And most importantly, they went back to the Magic Keyboard from the ill-fated Butterfly keyboard. But it all started kind of in 2019 with Throttlegate, when they tried to put that i9 into the MacBook Pro without making any other thermal considerations, basically. It's well documented. So the fact here that their own in-house silicon, the A12Z, returns comparable Geekbench numbers to an Intel i9, you have to realize that that is at much less of a power usage. That is much better performance per watt. It is using less electricity, aka less heat, to achieve the same amount of performance as compared to an Intel Core i9. So this performance per watt is going to be a game changer in several areas, in a couple areas at least. Of course, in several areas, but a couple areas that come to mind immediately. First is just going to be the thermal budget, the thermal headroom. You're going to be able to cool the chips that are running less hot a lot more efficiently, which means you're going to be able to get more performance out of those chips in the same chassis. And they could possibly even design the chassis even smaller. I'm not a huge fan of designing chassis even smaller just for the sake of designing them smaller, but that's one thing. You'll have a more headroom to work with to get more performance out because they are operating much more efficiently. Now, the second biggest area of improvement is going to be in battery life, in efficiency, running power off of a battery. We all know the inherent design benefits of an ARM processor, an ARM-based processor, and silicon system on chip versus running off of a traditional x86 CPU in terms of start time and on time and just connectivity and more efficient use of the processor, of electricity. This is going to basically mean that your batteries of the same capacity will run even longer. You'll get even more battery life because the system on chip, the Bionic system on chip, is using less electricity. One of the biggest areas of improvement to be made in humanity that we're still struggling with is how to get more and more energy density into the same amount of area of a battery. We're dealing with battery chemistry. We're dealing with all sorts of things to squeeze as many watts as possible out of that volume of battery. And going to Bionic system on chips away from x86 should help with this immensely. That is hugely exciting news. So some final thoughts as we wrap up here. This does not mean or signal the immediate end of x86 architecture. I don't think there's any way, I don't think there's any way in the next couple years for Apple's Bionic chips to overtake the power of, let's say, a 64-core AMD Threadripper. There's still going to be a place in this tech universe, in the computer world, for x86 processors, just for the grunt horsepower. I don't think you're going to see anytime soon a Disney movie fully rendered and fully created and fully edited completely on an Apple SoC completely. You're still going to need the brute horsepower of as many cores as possible, of processors that are as big as the palm of your hand to just brute force running that kind of code and doing that kind of compiling and doing that kind of work. But in the consumer sphere and the mobile computing sphere especially, this transition to Apple SoCs is going to have a major impact across the entire industry. I don't think it's going to be too long. And maybe, there's a lot of nuances here. There's a lot of different things that go into this, of course. But the idea of Dell XPS 13 or Dell XPS 15 going to some sort of ARM processor isn't that far-fetched. That being said, the next player in the game to Apple's Bionic chips would completely arguably would be companies like MediaTek and Qualcomm, but let's stick with Qualcomm in general just for this idea here. Qualcomm has come a long way, but is still behind overall what Apple can do with their chips. Again, Snapdragon processors are amazing, but Apple is ahead of the curve when it comes to these sorts of system on chips and the performance per watt that they can get out of it. So back to the XPS 13 and 15, just as an example here, obviously those aren't going to use Apple's system on chips, Apple Bionic chips, but it could be that this lights a fire under Qualcomm and MediaTek and the other ARM processor manufacturers' butts to start manufacturing chips that are as capable or start to compete with Apple's SoC. So when that happens, and I believe it will happen over the next few years, we're going to see just the entire paradigm shift across the entire industry from mobile computing on x86 to mobile computing on ARM processor, ARM-based processors. Again, this is not going to be industry-wide. It's not going to be for... I can't picture a Mac Pro running on an Apple SoC anytime soon. I think at least there'll be variants. I think that they will stick with Intel or AMD, probably. Most likely they'll go to AMD for their x86 based products. But for things like the MacBook Air, even the MacBook Pro, iMacs, other Mac Mini, other devices of that nature, Apple SoCs are the future, and it's going to set an industry-wide run on, like I said, Dell transitioning their XPS 13 to some sort of ARM-based processor for the performance per watt, for the energy efficiency, while we figure out how to make energy density of batteries greater. The transition to ARM has begun, and it's taken Apple. I think it's going to take a huge company like Apple just to, like I said, drop a meteor in that pond, not just a little pebble in the pond and wait for the ripples to go out and affect other things. They shook everything up here with WWDC 2020. And the last thought I'll mention here is that this is the Apple I have missed for over 15 years, I would say. Those of us who have lived long enough and grew up with Apple has traditionally been innovators, innovating the game. Now, You can argue different things about that. You can say that's fanboyism and you can say whatever, but it's been a while since Apple has listened to the customer in any meaningful way. That's just, maybe it's just my personal opinion, but Apple is finally listening to the consumer again, which is great. And they're doing innovative things like going to Apple in-house silicon, at least for their products, and doing that is going to shake up the entire industry in my estimation. This is the innovative, bold, I don't want to say brave, but bold Apple pressing into the future, actually listening to customers again, that we've missed for so long. This is the first thing they've done in 15 years at least, since going from PowerPC to Intel, that has been just this industry, this shift within Apple that's going to have effects across the industry. I miss this Apple. That doesn't mean prices are going to get better. That's not going to mean it's going to get any more affordable. There's still going to be an Apple tax. Many Apple devices are going to be a fashion statement. They're going to be a status symbol. Yes, we're not escaping that. It's going to be more expensive. Going with a non-Apple product is still probably going to be more bang for your buck. Although that might change a little bit depending on how powerful Apple SoCs get, and we know they are going to get more powerful. We'll see how that changes, but it's still going to cost money. Like I said, it's still going to be a status symbol for a lot of people who are just using them to write scripts at Starbucks and say, hey, look at me while I write a book here at Starbucks, who don't need a powerful PC to write scripts or to write books or to check emails. That's still going to be the case here. But Apple is making huge strides, and I, for one, applaud them for it. I'll be on the lookout for a new MacBook powered by Apple Silicon. That has me very excited, and for the ramifications across the entire industry, that has me very excited. So that's going to wrap it up for the YouTube channel. When I upload this to YouTube, we'll talk about whatever I may have missed in the comments below. There was a lot of other things in WWDC 2020 that I didn't bring up here in the podcast, but we can discuss those in the comments. We can discuss corrections in the comments. I don't pretend to know everything about everything, so if there's any clarifications that need to be discussed, of course, we can talk about that in the comment field below. But above all else, thank you for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, thanks for watching. This is a video in the interim. I have a huge DeLorean video coming out about my 1983 DeLorean DMC-12 and doing the repairs to the cooling system and a ride along. It's just a really cool video. So I hope you enjoy this podcast in the interim between the last big video and the next video coming down the pipe. Hope you enjoyed it. Visit www.geektherapyradio.com for more information. I have finally set up a merch store if you're curious. There's no t-shirts or apparel really in there right now because of, well, what's happening in 2020 right now. It's hard to manufacture those things, but I've got mugs, stickers, a beach towel. Why they can make a beach towel and not a t-shirt, I don't know. But for now, that's what I got over there at geektherapyradio.com. But above all else, know that you are worthy of love, both giving and receiving love, and you are worthy of your own self-confidence. Thank you so much for listening to Geek Therapy Radio. Thank you so much for watching Geek Therapy Radio today. Take care, be safe, and I'll talk to you next time. Oh man, this is so cool.